Listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Dan, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the July and August 2025 issue of the Smithsonian Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Starting with Prologue, The Past is Prologue, American Icon, by Chris Cara. Life in a Nutshell. With poignant wisdom and gentle wit, Charles M. Schulz reinvented the comic strip. Well, here comes old Charlie Brown, says one of the children as Charlie saunters past. Good old Charlie Brown. How I hate him. Blissfully ignorant of his peers' disdain, Charlie continues smiling. After all, he's making his debut as the lead character in the very first Peanut strip on October 2nd, 1950. Before, Charlie played little more than a bit part in Little Folks, a 4-panel strip by local cartoonist Charles M. Schulz. Running in Minnesota's St. Paul Pioneer Press from 1947 to 1950, the strip earned Schulz $10 a pop and showcased youngsters who were wise in whimsical ways beyond their years. In 1950, Schulz took a somewhat spiffed-up Little Folks to United Feature Syndicate for nationwide distribution. The group agreed to publish the strip with one stipulation. The name had to be changed. Little Folks was deemed too similar to multiple existing newspaper strips, so the syndicate rebranded it Peanuts, a reference to the Peanut Gallery on the Howdy Doody show, where boisterous little children sat. Though Schulz never liked the name and would harbor no small resentment of it for decades, the cartoonist nurtured Peanuts into one of the most successful comic strips in history. Today, Charlie Brown is one of the most recognizable characters on the planet. As Bill Watterson, the creator of Calvin and Hobbes, once observed, Peanuts pretty much defines the modern comic strip. In countless ways, Schulz blazed the wide trail that most every cartoonist since has tried to follow. In his syndicated debut, Charlie Brown appeared to the nation in his classic form. An ineffectual child with an oval head and a plain shirt. The distinctive zigzag was added 2 months later. He was a lovable, relatable loser, inspired by Schulz's own insecurities, melancholic and underwhelmed, but willing to make the best of it. Most of us are much more acquainted with losing than we are with winning, Schulz wrote in his 1975 book, Peanuts Jubilee, My Life and Art with Charlie Brown and Others. Winning is great, but it isn't funny. Charlie Brown lived in Hennepin County, Minnesota, with his parents, his younger sister, Sally, and his human-like beagle, Snoopy, introduced in the third strip. As the strip grew, so too did its idiosyncratic ensemble. Opinionated Lucy arrived in 1952 to represent Schulz's smart aleck side, while her security blanket-obsessed brother Linus, the cartoonist's curious and thoughtful side, as he put it, arrived later that year. While Charlie Brown played things safe, Snoopy lived an exuberant life in his imagination, casting himself as a frustrated novelist, gleeful dancer, merciless attorney, and even a prolific flying ace in a World War I Sopwith camel. Schulz told his wife Jenny, Snoopy is the way I would like to be, fearless, the life of the party, and brushing off Lucy's bad temper with a glancing kiss. Snoopy soon became a sort of poster pup for Peanuts, around the planet and beyond. In 1969, NASA christened the Apollo 10 lunar module Snoopy, while the black and white caps worn by the astronauts were known as Snoopy caps. The command module, of course, was called Charlie Brown. To the mellow sound of West Coast jazz, Charlie Brown began his televised life in 1965 with A Charlie Brown Christmas, which was commissioned and sponsored by the Coca-Cola Company and broadcast by CBS. Schultz himself wrote the story. Given the tiny budget, $76,000 or $766,000 today, and an overt religious message, including Linus's minute-long monologue from the Gospel of Luke, the network half expected the production to flop. Littered with animation errors, such as the inexplicable change in the number of branches on Charlie Brown's Little Christmas Tree, this handmade classic became an instant hit, winning a Peabody and an Emmy the following year. It still streams on Apple TV+. Although adults existed in the Peanuts universe, they were never seen, leaving the fun, games, and surprisingly profound conversations to children, dogs, and a small yellow bird known as Woodstock. Baseball mounds, kite-eating trees, and pumpkin patches were the settings for discourse about unrequited love, civil rights, loneliness, and morality. After 50 years appearing in more than 2,600 newspapers across 75 countries and 17,897 installments, all hand-drawn by Schultz, the final Peanut strip appeared in newspapers or papers on February 13, 2000, 2 months after Schultz announced his retirement due to ill health. Atop his doghouse, Snoopy sat at his typewriter to compose a heartfelt farewell to readers. Schultz had died the previous day. The final Peanuts panel announced there would be no new installments of the strip. Reruns, of course, began promptly. But Peanuts continues to reach new audiences, not least through its popular animated adventures, which continues on streamlining services. In anticipation of the strip's 75th anniversary, farmers in the United States and Canada partnered with Peanuts Worldwide to create a series of themed corn mazes last fall. More than 75 mazes, ranging in size from 1.5 to 20 acres, allowed people to get lost among their favorite characters. Charles's daughter, Jill, only wishes her dad could join the fun and see his creations writ large. Continuing with prologue, Origins. 4 fathers, tracing the centuries of innovation that sent the golf ball on a wild ride through history. Historians speculate that the first golfer was likely a shepherd who grew bored with his work one day, swung his crook, and made contact with a rock that went flying. He hit more, and purely by accident, one of the stones disappeared into a hole. Legendary sports writer Herbert Warren Wind mused in 1948. Once a second shepherd appeared to compete, or perhaps as soon as one of them began cursing over a misdirected ball, golf was invented. The earliest man-made golf balls ever uncovered were primitive spheres made of hardwood on the east coast of Scotland in the 14th century. By the early 1600s, players were using balls of cowhide stuffed with goose feathers. When doused with water, the leather shrank and the feathers expanded, and this rough-hewn ball would have flown well for the day, enabling golfers to make truer shots. But the craftsmanship was expensive, creating a sport primarily enjoyed by the well-off. With the advent of golf country clubs that required membership fees during the next century, it officially became a game for the elite. The idea for a greatly improved permutation came in the 1840s. Robert Patterson, a young Scottish divinity student, became transfixed by the possibilities of gutta percha, dried gum of the Malaysian sapodilla tree, which he found as protective filler in a package from Singapore containing a statue of a Hindu god. Patterson heated the sapodilla gum and massaged it until he'd formed a sphere and later painted it white. The so-called gutty ball was bouncier, easier to control, and much more affordable, making the game more accessible. The inventor of the modern ball was Coburn Haskell, who had an epiphany while strolling through the B.F. Goodrich rubber factory in Akron, Ohio. Spotting piles of elastic, Haskell had the idea of winding up some of the rubber yarn into a golf ball. Haskell eventually added a solid rubber core and cover. Legendary golfer Bobby Jones, co-founder of the Augusta National Golf Club as well as the Masters Tournament, described the Haskell ball, first brought to the market in 1901, as the most important development in the history of the sport. Jones was displeased, however, that the Haskell ball required less skill and more strength for long shots, and lamented that larger courses were needed to accommodate the greater distances the new balls sailed. Golfers eventually discovered that scuffed golf balls were traveling farther than new ones. Dimples were soon added, between 300 and 500, depending on your taste, after physicists confirmed that air flowed more freely over these balls, minimizing drag, and the increased spin created more lift. And recently, some players have begun sharpening their game by using smart golf balls, with embedded sensors that enable golfers to collect analytics about their shots, identify strengths and weaknesses in their game, and, of course, to help locate those pesky lost balls. For many enthusiasts, these innovations make the game more appealing and even addictive, enabling duffers on public courses to command drives and putts that golfers floundering on the sandy Scottish links more than 600 years ago could never imagine. And staying with prologue, books. A Man in Full. A new biography offers the most intimate portrait yet of one of the 20th century's greatest authors, by Brandon Tensley. In 1950, James Baldwin and his lover, the painter Lucien Happersberger, set out from Paris for the mountains of Switzerland, where Baldwin, then around 25, hoped to climb his way out of a creative funk. It worked. While hiking, Baldwin nearly fell down a ravine, but Happersberger grabbed him, saving his life. Out of this frightening biblical experience, writes Nicholas Boggs in his new book, Baldwin, A Love Story, that day Baldwin conjured the final title for his novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Drawing on previous scholarship, materials held at archives such as Yale University's Baldwin Collection, and decades of interviews with Baldwin and his friends and confidants, Boggs's book is the first major biography of the writer to focus on his most intimate male relationships, both romantic and platonic. Boggs shows, for instance, how Happersberger, whom Baldwin met a year after moving to Paris and later called the love of his life, gave the young writer, pictured above in Kilyos, Turkey, 1965, the sense of connection and rootedness he needed to write during a time of tremendous uncertainty, having recently left behind his life in New York. Boggs also writes about how Beaufort Delaney, a black gay painter 20 years Baldwin's senior, whom the writer called his spiritual father, helped the young writer, then struggling with his craft and sexual identity, to see the beauty of the world around him and to begin to see it within himself. And the book relays a touching story about how Delaney gave Baldwin the courage to buy a one-way ticket to Paris by promising to join him there, though at the time neither of them was certain it would happen. Previous books about Baldwin treated his relationships with men, whether lovers or friends, as a side note or ignored them almost entirely. By focusing on these men, other examples include Joran Kazak, a French artist and sometimes lover, and Engin Cesar, a Turkish actor and creative collaborator, Boggs traces the relationships that shaped Baldwin's life and art, which in turn has had such an indelible impact on the literary and political landscape of the 20th century. In Boggs' hands, Baldwin's life story feels complete. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Smithsonian Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Hey, moving on to the feature article of this magazine, Exploring Hemingway's Pamplona by Tony Perrotet. An offbeat journey to the legendary Spanish festival 100 years after the life-changing trip that inspired The Sun Also Rises. In the annals of European travel, few summer holidays have been so artistically productive as the trip taken by the aspiring 25-year-old writer Ernest Hemingway in July 1925 to Pamplona, the elegant Spanish provincial town in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Hem, as he was called by his friends, traveled from Paris with his first wife, Hadley Richardson, to attend the annual festival of the San Fermin, whose most famous element is the running of the bulls, where mostly young men in white outfits with red bandanas and sashes race a dozen enormous bulls and steers through narrow cobbled streets, with the occasional bloody goring or stomping along the way. It was an immersive event with an electric mood, as he found during his first visit with Richardson 2 years earlier, when he had jotted notes. Fifes, drums, reed pipes, red neckerchiefs, circling, lifting, floating, dance, all day, all night. Leather wine bottles over shoulder, flat basque caps or wide straw hats, faces like smoked buckskin, flat backs, flat hips, dancing, dancing. He was dazzled by the spectacular daily bullfights, as well as the fireworks, bands on the plaza, packed cafes, cheap wine, and faces in the crowd. The faces of Velasquez drinkers, Goyo and Greco faces. On their third and most romantic visit to the festival, in 1925, Hemingway and Richardson were joined by 5 Anglo-American expat friends, all heavy drinking, rootless bohemians like himself. The intense alcohol-fueled, sexually charged interaction inspired Hemingway to write his first and arguably finest novel, The Sun Also Rises, using thinly veiled characters and incidences from the Sojourn. The milestone of modernist literature was published in New York the following year, immediately putting the young author on the path to international celebrity as the voice of the post-war lost generation, and incidentally, changing Pamplona forever. For centuries, the 9-day event had been just one of dozens of annual Spanish festivals, many of which also involve encierros, or bull runs. But its profile skyrocketed as The Sun Also Rises became a smash bestseller and was later made into a 1957 hit film starring Tyrone Power, Errol Flynn, and Ava Gardner. Largely thanks to the novel's success and Hemingway's follow-up meditations, Death in the Afternoon, from 1932, and the posthumous The Dangerous Summer, San Fermin became established as the ultimate Spanish celebration. Today it is one of Europe's most popular gatherings, luring more than 1 million visitors every year, with a round-the-clock party atmosphere that puts Mardi Gras in New Orleans to shame. It has become so popular that as many as 3,500 runners clog the bull running course, making trampling the biggest danger. And yet the American connection to Pamplona remains unshakable. Many American runners and spectators have attended for decades, along with niche groups of aficionados, such as the New York City club Torino, Bullfighters Club, who relish the traditions and pageantry of San Fermin, but don't train as matadors themselves. People who go to Pamplona inspired by Hemingway are surprised at first, says Jennifer May Ryland, a young Brooklyn-based artist and club member. It can seem like spring break in Florida, but the town's traditional life still goes on behind the scenes. It's still wildly romantic. In fact, I first learned about the less visible cultural dimensions of the San Fermins, as Spaniards call the festival, when Ryland invited me to attend several lectures at the Club Torino, in a grand 19th century townhouse in Manhattan's West Village. One night, a Spanish fashion academic brought a collection of antique matador outfits known as trajes de luces, suits of lights, and discussed the new wave of women matadors. Another night, a Peruvian journalist explained how medieval Spanish bullfighting traditions were transformed in the New World. The Pamplona fiesta's most passionate fans feel it is often seen superficially. San Fermin is so much more than the running of the bulls and the street parties, says Laure Monique, the club president who has attended every summer for some 40 years. There are the concerts, dances, social clubs, gastronomic societies, religious processions. It's an all-consuming social and cultural event. Monig, Ryland, and other members offered to take me to meet the Pamplones, the people of Pamplona, and join gatherings filled with Spanish artists, gourmands, and musicians. And so I found myself last summer rereading The Sun Also Rises and heading to the Pyrenees, hoping to glimpse behind the Fiesta's surface while piecing together the true story behind Hemingway's generation-defining book. Having lived in Paris with Richardson on and off since late 1921, Hemingway was a struggling writer who could be spotted scribbling in left bank cafes, a tall, lanky Midwesterner with unkempt hair, wearing sneakers, old trousers, and a patched jacket. Handsome and charismatic with boundless energy and infectious, boyish smile, he was also an insecure bully, a side that emerged particularly when he was drinking. In the spring of 1925, he was also suffering from one of the cyclical bouts of depression that would mar his life. He was bogged down in his attempts to write a novel and frustrated that his poetry and short stories had appeared in obscure magazines but made no dent in the American market. Beyond the left bank cafes, he was virtually unknown. But the depression began to lift when he and Richardson took the train from Paris to Spain in late June for a pre-fiesta fishing stopover, sending their young son John, Bumpy, with a nanny, to Brittany. Although they had little money, Hemingway and Richardson often took advantage of the strong American dollar and traveled widely in Europe. They had first visited Pamplona in 1923 on the advice of Gertrude Stein and her partner, Alice B. Toklas, and Hemingway had been instantly enthralled. It had become a summer tradition for the couple to meet friends at the fiesta. He later recalled the 1924 visit with writer John dos Passos as the goddamnedest wild time and fun you ever saw. In the 1925 trip, their third, promised to be, he assured one invitee in a letter, a damned good time. Just south of the border, the couple were joined for trout fishing in the Irati River by Hemingway's boyhood pal from Michigan, Bill Smith, who had been best man at his wedding, and the American writer Donald Ogden Stewart, a regular member of the Algonquin Round Table in New York, and a successful satirist. Even though they caught almost no fish, Hemingway melancholy promised to dissolve entirely when the group arrived in Pamplona on July 2nd to convene with 3 other expat friends coming from Paris. Instead, the vacation group was plunged into bitter infighting. The catalyst for the drama was Lady Duff Twisden, a 34-year-old socialite from the louche British upper classes who had become a scandalous minor celebrity in Paris for her beauty, her unique style, and her many affairs. Slender and gray-eyed, with a ribald sense of humor, she sported a short, boyish haircut and wore eyebrow-raising androgynous clothes and fedoras. She was also an Olympic-level drinker, a bewitching combination to some men who happily paid her massive bar tabs since she was perpetually broke. Although Twisden arrived in Pamplona with her fiancé, a jovial young Scottish war veteran and alcoholic named Patrick Guthrie, jealousies erupted when it somehow came out that she had recently spent 2 weeks on a romantic liaison in a French coastal retreat, Saint-Jean-de-Luz, with the final member of the Pamplona group, a moneyed, preppy, and tightly wound 33-year-old Princeton University graduate named Harold Loeb. Hemingway already resented Loeb's inherited wealth. He was the cousin of Peggy Guggenheim, and his literary success. Loeb was a founding editor of an arts magazine, Broom, and his first novel was about to come out in New York. Despite being married, Hemingway was infuriated by the news that Loeb had enjoyed a fling with the alluring Twisden. Although there is no evidence that Hemingway and Twisden ever had an affair, he had become captivated by her in Paris. And when this fraught menagerie was thrown into Europe's most raucous street party, emotions would soon boil over. Hemingway's biographers lamented that recreating the 1925 trip is a challenge. In Pamplona, writes Michael Reynolds in Hemingway, The Paris Years, time twisted and days became interwoven and inseparable, making every participant's memory a work of fiction. This was also a side effect of the fiesta's wild and inebriated energy. There seemed no point sleeping, Reynolds added. Sleep was dead. Traveling to the fiesta a century later, I could sympathize. Even on the regional train from Zaragoza to Pamplona, the festivities were in full swing. Crowds of Spaniards and foreigners sprawled across the floor on suitcases and backpacks, sharing bottles of cava, the Spanish bubbly, and passing around plates of ham, cheese, grapes, and olives, while outside flashed a rural world of abandoned farmhouses, Roman aqueducts, and spired Gothic castles. Walking from the train station into Pamplona's old town, I turned a corner and was plunged straight into the Dionysian frenzy. Every cobbled lane was blocked by revelers, crowded outside the bars, all wearing white and red fiesta costumes. The origins of this tradition outfit are hazy, but white smocks have been worn since the Middle Ages by Basque peasants, and they were popularized by one of the working-class peñas, or social clubs, after 1929. The red scarves, according to one tradition, are an homage to Saint Firmin, the first bishop and patron saint of the town, who was beheaded by the Romans around the 3rd century A.D. At noon of Sunday, the 6th of July, the fiesta exploded, Hemingway wrote in The Sun Also Rises. The chaotic ambiance was fueled by cheap local wine, absinthe, and Fundador brandy, and was exacerbated by having to shout every word to be heard. Everything became quite unreal finally, and it seemed as though nothing could have any consequences. Today, music is still everywhere. Live bands and Basque flutists pirouette around gigantes and big heads, dancers with enormous papier-mâché heads of historical figures including kings, queens, and Moors. A stage is set up in a plaza for singers to perform cheerful regional songs, with mariachi-like lilt. All night, the social clubs parade around the streets, blaring tubas, horns, and drums. At one point, a trumpeter played an impromptu solo of a haunting traditional tune. He turned out to be Manuel Blanco, a star of the Spanish National Orchestra and choir. That's what we call in Pamplona a momentico, a little moment, one local said. He's the best trumpet player in Spain. Manuel Blanco. The appearance of Pamplona's old town, flanked by a star-shaped stone fortress, has also changed little since Hemingway's day. To follow his 1925 trail, I headed for the central Plaza del Castillo and stopped in at his favorite spots, Café Uruña, with its polished mirrors and worn tile floors, and Bar Choco, or pronounced Choco, the Hotel Quintana, where the expat group stayed, fictionalized as the Hotel Montoya in the novel, is now an apparent apartment building, although its exclusive Art Nouveau facade remains. Hemingway chose the Quintana because it was where the matadors stayed, and he assumed the role of the inside tour guide for his friends. He donned a Basque boina, the local beret, and took pride in chatting with the hotel's owner, Juanito Quintana, about the minutiae of the bullfights in his fractured Spanish. Much later, during an interview, Quintana remembered Hemingway unflatteringly as a very strange person with a bad character. The writer's entourage was constantly drunk and rowdy, often stumbling back into the hotel at 3 a.m. and provoking complaints from other guests. When Quintana confronted Hemingway one night, the writer made excuses until the hotelier warned him, "If you don't let Matador Cayetano Ordóñez sleep, tomorrow you'll be fighting in the bouldering yourself." The matter of the bullfighter's sleep made an impression on Hemingway. No more, Juanito," he said. The daily schedule of the festival begins, as it did then, at noon on July 6th, by launching a rocket called the Chupinazo, and for the next 8 days as a running of the bulls every morning at 8, and a corrida, or bullfight, every evening at 6:30. On my first morning, I got up at dawn, slugged down a café con leche, then squeezed among the spectators onto stone steps above Estefeta Street, part of the half-mile route of the running of the bulls, when the day's 6 toros bravos, fighting bulls destined for the evening's bullfights, are raced from a corral to the stadium with 6 local steers, castrated bulls, that guide them along the route. Although they're difficult to pin down, the ritual's origins are believed to date at least from the Middle Ages, when peasants brought cattle from the countryside to the market in summer and ran the route themselves. In photographs from Hemingway's time, the most striking thing is how empty the route looks, with only a few dozen young farmhands scattering ahead of the bull's horns. These days, it becomes a river of white and red-clad runners, and the event is a major logistical production. In the pre-dawn darkness, workers erect wooden barricades along the route and remove them daily, and thousands of spectators gather alongside or hang from balconies above. Around 7 a.m., a loudspeaker blares the rules in Spanish and English. The running of the bulls is not for everyone. It calls for composure, sobriety, good reflexes, and outstanding physical fitness. It is impossible to run the entire course. Do not incite the bulls, attract their attention, or touch them. While crowd members pass around newspapers with descriptions of the 6 animals' names, weights, and breeders. Although it was originally an all-male right, the bull running rules were relaxed in 1974, and a sprinkling of women now join. At around 7:45 a.m., the runners sing a chant to a statue of Saint Fermin, asking for protection. Then at precisely 8 a.m., one rocket is set off, and the bulls burst from the corral. The earth begins to shake as the animals, each one a small tank of muscle, thunder along the route at speeds of up to 20 miles an hour, scattering runners. The bulls are intent on reaching their goal. Only if one is separated from the pack does it panic and lash out with its horns. So the runner's challenge is to get out of the way. But thanks to the crowds, they can trip one another or pile up in bottlenecks and be stomped or gored. Some 200 medical workers were posted along the route to aid the injured, whose numbers range from 200 to 300 over the 8 days. Even so, since records began being kept in 1910, 16 runners have been killed. The municipal website offers a gruesomely detailed list of fatalities, noting that a 22-year-old Illinois native was gored to death in front of the town hall in 1995 when a bull named Castellano sliced through a kidney, puncturing his liver, and severed a main artery. The most recent fatality was in 2009, when a 27-year-old from near Madrid slipped and was gored by the left horn of a rogue bull named Cappuccino. There is no record of Hemingway ever running with the bulls himself, but he and his male friends joined the crowds in the arena afterward, where they could play amateur matador against younger bulls with padded horns. On one occasion, Loeb managed to sit on a bull's head and be carried around, making him the king of the ring in Pamplona and stealing attention from Hemingway. Today, this amateur hour still occurs in the stadium with smaller heifers, although they can still pack a punch, as I saw when one luckless young man was hit by a horn in the jaw and lost several teeth. Afterward, runners gathered outside Bar Choco to sip chocolate or vanilla milk with cognac and gossip about the morning event, referring to dangerous stretches like La Curva, the curve, a hard right-hand turn with a pocket dubbed Dead Man's Corner. If you run with the bulls long enough, something is going to happen to you, confided a Canadian who said he ran for 17 years until a bull cracked several of his ribs and injured his neck. An Argentine runner confessed he had no feeling in his left arm due to the nerve damage from being stomped. Others boasted about how often they had been hospitalized and delighted in showing off their scars. In 2019, some runners even held a sit-down protest against the encierro becoming too safe after authorities began spraying the cobblestones along the route with an adhesive to prevent slips. As one Irish runner complained to me, "We'll be running with the Labradors next." At 10 a.m., Monig, the New York City club Torino's director, led me to an unmarked 18th century archway, only steps from Bar Choco, that opened onto a grandiose marble staircase and up to a casino. Not a gambling hall, but a private social club where a dance party was underway, fueled by brandy, wine, and cañas, small glasses of draft beer. The ballroom, a jewel box of ornate wood paneling, gilt mirrors and chandeliers, was packed with white-clad Pamploneses of all ages, dancing and singing to a live band and shouting from balconies at passers-by below. A couple of hours later, we ducked down to a side alley to another unmarked portal. which turned out to be the home of a gastronomic club called Napardi Society. The hosts led us downstairs to the club's historic cellar kitchen, built into the medieval walls of the village. The guests included two retired matadors in their early 50s. Juan Jose Padilla was nicknamed the Pirate for his black eye patch, the result of a severe goring in 2011. The other, Francisco Rivera Ordóñez, casually chatted about his childhood connections to the United States when he was sent to summer camp in Maine and military school in Indiana. I only realized I was in the presence of bullfighting royalty when Rivera Ordóñez mentioned that Orson Welles' ashes are interned on the grounds of his family ranch. The Hemingway connection suddenly came to life. He was the great-grandson of the matador Cayetano Ordóñez, who had stayed at Hotel Quintana in 1925 and appears as the handsome young matador Pedro Romero in The Sun Also Rises. The best-looking boy I've ever seen, Hemingway writes. What's more, he was the grandson of Antonio Ordóñez, one of history's greatest matadors, the Babe Ruth of the bull ring, who features in Hemingway's posthumous ode The Dangerous Summer, and was fast friends with Welles, another aficionado. After Welles died in 1985, the director's daughter decided to inter his ashes in a dry well on the Ordóñez family ranch in Ronda. Afterwards, as we strolled with the matadors through the street, passers-by stopped in their tracks to stare, shout greetings, or request autographs and selfies. Hemingway would have approved. While the Encierro is Pamplona's most publicized event, devotees cherish a more exclusive ritual held every day at 1 p.m. The apartado, or separation, of the 6 toros bravos in the special pen attached to the stadium. Again, Monique led me through an anonymous-looking doorway into a self-contained world. An elegantly coiffed crowd of Spanish artists, politicians, bull breeders, and lifelong aficionados gathered on 2 tiers overlooking the corral, while sipping Andalusian Fino, a light sherry, as the 3 matadors were assigned their bulls for the evening by drawing lots from the mayor's hat. True diehards in the audience could also snack on criadillas, bull's testicles. I passed, but many Pamplona restaurants offer bull on the menu, including estofado de toro, a rich stew that is surprisingly tender and tasty. From there, we dashed to the annual luncheon hosted by the club Torino de Pamplona, which was founded in the late 1940s and has its headquarters near the stadium. Some 100 local guests sat at trestle tables laid end to end in a leafy park and were served mountainous platters of grilled meat, fish stews, and salads. I found myself next to a doctor who worked at the emergency room in the bullfighting stadium. It's one of the best places in Spain to have an accident, he boasted. I have a full operating theater. News of social events was passed around by word of mouth. The next afternoon, Monique got wind of a reception at a private bullfighting museum. It was opened in 1984 by a local aficionado named Marcelino Jimenez Elizagare in his own apartment and lovingly preserved after his death in 2006 by his wife, Mary. This time we climbed a series of creaking wooden stairs to find an Aladdin's cave of artifacts. Every inch of wall space was covered with vintage posters, bejeweled matador outfits, antique photographs, one of Antonio Ordóñez posing with the bewhiskered Hemingway in 1959, and a handsome replica of an 18th century bull ring, complete with hundreds of detailed human figures. The wine was flowing. A professorial cortador, or slicer, was cutting ruby-red shreds from a side of ham, and a dozen white-clad tenors, among them members of bullfighter Andres Roca Reyes Cuadrilla, which was a support team, burst into spontaneous rendition of the so-called Asrain Waltz, a refrain heavy with civic pride. Because the festivities have arrived in this glorious city, which is something like no other in the entire world, Real Real. At 6:30, Pamploneses converge on the central and most controversial ritual of the festival, the corridas, or races, as bullfights are known in Spanish. Some scholars speculate that bullfighting origins were in the Roman era in the Middle Ages, but the corrida began to take its modern form in the 1700s, when Spanish cattle ranchers vied to breed the most powerful and handsome bulls, like thoroughbred horses. Towns all over Spain developed festival rites that included different versions of the bull runs and often ended with men fighting the finest animals with matadors in ornate, tightly fitting outfits, taking to plazas on horseback and on foot. These diverse traditions were codified into a ritual that has changed little in the centuries since. Today, the evening starts with a procession, when 3 bullfighters, their teams, and stadium workers enter the ring and salute the president, who runs the event. The matadors each fight 2 bulls in contests that last for roughly 20 minutes and end with the animal's death. The only way for a bull to survive is if the crowd demands that it is too beautiful and should become a stud, an extremely rare occurrence. In Pamplona, the corridas occur only during San Fermin and are held in the majestic Plaza de Toros. The approaching road to the stadium was renamed the Paseo de Hemingway in 1967, and a bronze statue was erected of him at the arena's entrance in 1968, glowering at visitors as he once did at anyone who questioned the value of bullfights. Tastes, of course, have changed. In recent years, animal rights activists in Europe and the United States have called for an end to these contests. There are critics even within Spain, and bullfights were banned for a time in Catalonia. They have also been banned in much of Latin America. Many foreign attendees at San Fermin have no stomach for the spectacle and spend their early evenings carousing in local bars instead. Hemingway tried to explain to critics that bullfighting was not a sport. It was a tragedy, and his obsession with bullfights had a philosophical side. He was both fascinated and horrified by the senseless, random violence of modern life, having nearly been killed by an artillery shell at age 18 while volunteering as a Red Cross ambulance driver on the Italian front in World War I. In bullfighting, Hemingway discovered violence that was ritualized and controlled, and in which death was openly confronted. As Reynolds puts it, for Hemingway, it was like watching the war from a ringside seat. Even in 1925, not everyone shared Hemingway's passion for bullfighting. Richardson would turn her eyes away and embroider during the goriest parts, while Loeb admitted he was unimpressed, saying, "We all have to die, but I don't like to be reminded of it more than twice a day." Whatever your opinion, the event's extravagant pageantry making it a lively relic from the time of Cervantes and Velázquez, the vast open-air arena lit by the golden sun, and the packed with 19,500 people in white outfits and red scarves, roaring and singing. Seats are reserved year by year by the same families, and everyone knows their neighbors and brings wine and delicacies like tortilla sandwiches to share. The stadium seats are divided into sol and sombra, sun and shade, with the cheap upper tiers of the sun-blasted side taking up the social clubs whose bands play cacophonous music with tubas, trumpets, and drums. These range from traditional romantic tearjerkers to outbursts of jingle bells and even Neil Diamond's Sweet Caroline. The gleeful air of anarchy in Pamplona is very different from bullfights in Madrid and Sevilla, where the ambiance is so reverent that the expression goes, "You can hear the bull breathe." After the few days of revelry, going to sleep at 3 a.m., waking up at 6 a.m., bull runs, lunches, aperitivos, dances, my constitution was reeling. 100 years ago, the same regime made the expats' behavior go from bad to worse. The dancing kept up, the drinking kept up, the noise went on, Hemingway wrote in The Sun Also Rises. Guthrie, Loeb, and Hemingway jousted with one another to gain the attentions of Lady Duff Twisden, who provoked her admirers by flirting with the young matador Ordóñez. One night she disappeared at a party and turned up the next morning with an unexplained black eye. Guthrie, her fiancé, took to casually goading Loeb about how Twisden now spurned him, while Loeb accepted the insults with a stoic passivity, mooning over Twisden. The others felt like a lovesick puppy. Meanwhile, Richardson was appalled to observe Hemingway's evident infatuation. On the 6th night, tensions came to a head. Over after-dinner brandies in the plaza beneath exploding fireworks, Hemingway told Loeb that he should go back to Paris. "You've already done enough to spoil this party." Loeb declared that he would only depart if Twisden asked him so. She refused, making Hemingway snarl, "You lousy bastard, running to a woman." Loeb challenged the much larger Hemingway to a fight, and the pair went down an alley to punch it out. But as soon as they got there, the tensions diffused. When Loeb took off his spectacles, Hemingway joked that he would hold Loeb's jacket. Loeb offered to hold Hemingway's. They both laughed. Duff, Loeb later wrote, no longer seemed to matter. Hemingway even left Loeb a letter of apology the next morning, saying he was thoroughly ashamed of his behavior. On the last day of the vacation, when everyone was preparing to leave Pamplona, Twisden and Guthrie declared that they had no money to pay their hotel bill. Stewart lent the pair funds that he knew were as good as gone. The exhausted crew went their separate ways, scattered around Europe. The fiesta was over, but their literary afterlives were just beginning. Hemingway left Pamplona with a lousy feeling, he later wrote, but it faded as he and Richardson took the train south in a compartment with a wine salesman who shared his samples. The vacation may have been a fiasco, but it provided him with a literary inspiration. In Madrid, he threw himself into writing in the mornings, scribbling furiously by hand on loose leaves of paper, and watching bullfights with Richardson in the afternoon. Hemingway's first pages were a cross between a memoir and a travel book, but soon he changed his friends' names and fictionalized the situation, in particular altering the narrator's name from Hem to Jake Barnes, a war veteran who was wounded in the groin and made impotent, adding a hopelessness to his infatuation with Lady Brett Ashley, as Twisden was renamed. I'd like to pause for a minute to remind you that you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Smithsonian Magazine on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. The free-living, hard-drinking Brett uses wit and jollity to mask her inner desperation. She also runs off to Madrid with a young bullfighter and after refusing to marry him, has to be rescued, broke, by Jake. Along the way, the lovelorn Harold Loeb became Robert Cohn, in a harsh and blatantly anti-Semitic characterization that turned Hemingway's once close friend into a figure of derision. One writer has noted, who was a cross between a boob and a bore. Richardson, meanwhile, was written out of the story entirely. Within 8 weeks, Hemingway had completed a draft. His friend F. Scott Fitzgerald helped him edit the manuscript, convincing him that the rambling first 2 chapters should be cut. The finished novel was published by Scribner in October 1926 to strong reviews and sales, with Hemingway's terse style appealing to both highbrow literary circles and mainstream readers. The novel was elevated from a gossipy roman, a cliff, to a literary event by an epigraph from Gertrude Stein, which proclaimed that the poorly behaved characters were in fact part of the lost generation, the first usage in print of this now famous term. It's difficult to imagine the book's impact today, when every generation from the Beats to Gen Z has felt itself lost, but it gave expression to the existential malaise left by the First World War, which shattered traditional values and left its survivors purposeless. The novel was, biographer Mary Dearborn writes, perhaps the first great novel of disaffected youth. For the real-life characters, it meant the end of friendships. For the rest of his life, Loeb was puzzled as to why his friend Hemingway had betrayed him. Loeb had even helped get some of his early writings in print, and tried to set the record straight in a 1959 memoir, The Way It Was, and 1967 essay, Hemingway's Bitterness. Although Lady Twisden had been reduced to the promiscuous Lady Ashley, an alcoholic nymphomaniac, Hemingway later called her character, she appears to have been more philosophical, telling one mutual friend in Paris, "Of course, Hemingway said many nasty things, but after all he was writing a novel. Who cares? Not me." Still, they soon fell out of touch in Paris. Hemingway's marriage to Richardson had also been damaged. His wandering eyes soon focused on a mutual friend, the American heiress Pauline Pfeiffer, and the two began an affair. When Hemingway invited both his wife and lover to Pamplona in 1926, the trip was predictably strained, and when he and Richardson returned to Paris by train, they left via different station exits to separate homes. When he returned to the festival in 1927, Hemingway was accompanied by Pfeiffer as his new wife. By then, The Sun Also Rises had put Hemingway on track to become one of the most celebrated American writers of the 20th century, establishing the macho persona he would build on for the rest of his life. Zelda Fitzgerald, for one, thought his bravura a fraud, sniffing that nobody could be, quote, as male as all that. Her verdict on The Sun Also Rises was just as caustic. It was about bullfighting, bull slinging, and bull fill in the blanks. Even so, consistently appears today on lists of great American novels. Hemingway continued to visit San Fermin throughout his life, although with a long interruption of 22 years thanks to the Spanish Civil War, which he reported on and made the subject of his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, and the subsequent military dictatorship of Francisco Franco. When he returned in 1953 with his fourth wife, Mary Welsh, he was still not well known among the Spanish public. The Sun Also Rises had filtered into the country only through stray copies printed in Argentina, and many regarded it with bemusement. The following year, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. By his next visit to the festival, in 1959, Hemingway was at the height of his fame, now the bearded, bear-like papa, and mobbed by well-wishers, autograph hunters, and journalists from Spain and beyond. As for San Fermin's festival, it ends, as it has for centuries, with thousands of townsfolk gathering before the town hall to sing Pobre de mi, or Por mi, a lament that the 9 days of madness are over. As people leave their bandanas by candles at the nearby church door, the mayor exhorts them to start their countdown for the next year's party. I don't know how you're going to write a story about San Fermin, Monig said, when we met for one last drink on the way to the train station. It has no beginning and no end. You think it's over, but it's not. Once you've been here, you'll never really leave. And moving on, going back to prologue, medicine, I'm going to start a story that may not have time to finish, but it's worth starting. Fighting to Serve. With their bravery during World War I, these daring American women doctors proved their might to the folks back home. By Amy Sohn. In late March 1918, the German army began pursuing the Spring Offensive in France, its most ambitious advance since the First War began 4 years earlier. Back in the United States, an enterprising group of suffragists was mounting an ambitious advance of its own. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, was lobbying to get women doctors into the trenches. Though their own government tried to deter them, NAWSA succeeded, sending a pioneering group of 74 doctors and support staff to some of the most dangerous areas of wartime France. The heroic service of this group, known as the Women's Overseas Hospitals, or WOH, would be the most professionally demanding undertaking in the lives of these doctors, who would prove to the world the competency and courage of women physicians. Archives, memoirs, and personal letters passed down to the doctors and descendants reveal a thrilling, politically relevant chapter in women's, medical, and World War I history that has been largely unknown until now. By the spring of 1918, New York and 11 other states had given women the right to vote. The House had passed the federal suffrage amendment, and voting rights advocates were lobbying the Senate to do the same. Many members of NAWSA or NAWSA hoped that President Woodrow Wilson would be more likely to support women's right to vote if they contributed to the war effort in visible, dramatic ways. As Carrie Chapman Catt, the group's president, wrote in a letter to several of the WOH doctors that spring, quote, "We have staked our reputation on the maintenance of a hospital unit which will win laurels for womankind," end quote. In 1910, women made up only 6% of all American doctors, many of them practicing in traditionally feminine fields like obstetrics and public health, while facing limited opportunities for faculty appointments. Surgery in battle, on the other hand, was one of the greatest educational value and opportunities all surgeons must covet, in the words of Mabel Seagrave, a WOH doctor from Seattle. In April 1917, when the U.S. entered the war, Caroline Finley was 42 and director of obstetrics at the New York Infirmary for Women and Children. The infirmary's Women's Medical College, founded in 1868 by doctors and sisters Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell, had been the first American medical institution run by and for women. Now, in addition to their patriotic feelings, Finley and a group of her colleagues were concerned about the suffering of women and children in war-torn regions of Europe, and particularly about rape, neglected prenatal care, and malnutrition, and they wanted to help firsthand. Seeking official sponsors, the doctors went to the Red Cross and then to the U.S. Army, both of which promptly rejected them. Secretary of War Newton Baker declared that he did not believe commissioning women would help win the war. With their own country turning its back, the infirmary group applied to the French. At the outset of the war in 1914, the French government had not allowed women's physicians to serve in any capacity, including as nurses. By now, though, they were desperate. After a meeting in the fall of 1917 with the French High Commissioner in Washington, Finley received a cable from Premier Alexandre Ribot. Send Doctoress Finley and her associates at once. The French decree allowed WOH doctors to provide civilian care, but stipulated that those services could only extend to the wounded in the French military upon request, if the need arose. In November 1917, days after New York became the first Eastern state to grant women the right to vote, Finley went to Paris to place the first unit. 31 other WOH medical support staff, including plumbers and chauffeurs, all women, arrived in Bordeaux in February 1918 on the ocean liner Espagne. Docking at 6 in the morning, the group looked, as Anne von Schally of Queens, an infirmary doctor and WOH treasurer, wrote to NASA headquarters, like a traveling circus. After several delays, one hospital site was destroyed in a bombing raid, and another was deemed too dangerous. About half the group, led by Finley, was indeed called to a military hospital in Neuss, north of Paris. Finley's group, known as Unit 1, traveled by truck to Chateau Ognon, a stately home that a week before had been turned into an evacuation hospital, and a few miles north of Senlis, on the road of Compiègne, the eventual site of the armistice. The group emerged into the courtyard of the beautiful Beaux-Arts Chateau. The salon, where the women slept, rivaled the splendor of the Palace of Versailles, with ceilings, cupids, and velvet tapestries. Finley marveled at the surroundings in a letter. But there wasn't much time to smell the flowers. In the central portion of the chateau, beneath the stately portraits, mostly empty hospital cots filled the hallways. The only medical staff were 2 French military doctors and a few nurses. The men initially refused to give orders to the Dame Americaine. Soon, though, they had no choice. Following a major offensive nearby, ambulances rushed in, bringing 300 patients in 20 hours. At first, Finley and the WAOH doctors served as nurses, assisting the men with life-saving amputations, while French priests serving as orderlies held lanterns. When morphine and anesthetics ran out, the French doctors operated on conscious patients. The soldiers, Finley wrote to her mother, have arms and legs hanging by a shred. Many have horrible chest and head wounds. The limited medical supplies included a pot-bellied stove, a pail of water for sterilization, sheets torn into strips to be boiled in the pail, anti-tetanus serum, and bandages. At daybreak, chloroform and ether arrived from Paris, along with further staff, including the male chief surgeon, Dr. Cuvier. The women worked 16-hour days, gaining confidence. By early May, the chateau was home to 500 beds. The women's friendships quickly deepened. The French doctors were not so kind. When Finley asked Cuvier for permission to treat septic shock cases, he said no, but allowed that perhaps the Unit 1 doctors could give more important work once they proved themselves. A week after Finley's request, Cuvier got too desperate to be sexist, and he gave her control of an entire septic shock ward. I think to have been given the only thing I have asked for after a week's proof of the kind of work we do is a very good augury for the future, she reported in a letter to NASA. Soon she was performing major operations such as amputations and deep dissections, assisted by a French doctor. She had never done an amputation until she went to France, but quickly became an expert. The WHO team found that the work took a toll. The other day I was terribly depressed, Finley wrote in a letter. It was necessary to hurt the men so in dressing their wounds that sometimes I can hardly stand it. One soldier had been groaning and crying. When she finished operating, he patted my arm and said, "Pauvre madame." As debilitating as war surgery could be, Finley took pride in her new skills. Lately, I have been operating a good deal and have had very interesting work, she wrote to her mother. I did 8 secondary operations without a doctor to assist me. My arms ached when I finished. To the chateau's misfortune, it sat along the course that German warplanes followed on their nightly raids to Paris. The evening of June 17th was calm and clear, but close to daybreak a German warplane bombed the chateau, leaving a crater in the earth and a trail of carnage. By the time Finley, fellow WOH Dr. Mary Lee Edward, and the rest had picked through the debris, they tallied 18 orderlies and stretcher bearers killed and 12 wounded, all men they had come to know. The house was bombed 2 more times, but perhaps more remarkably, no women from Unit 1 died. Among the most prolific healers...
The following program is intended for listeners who are blind,